When we look back at the financial history of the 19th century, the Panic of 1873 often stands out as one of its defining crises. It is commonly remembered as a time of unmitigated disaster, an economic earthquake that leveled everything in its path, leaving both rich and poor in ruin. But this common understanding tells only part of the story. While it is true that the panic ushered in a long and painful period of economic stagnation, the idea that everyone suffered equally is not entirely accurate. There was a story beneath the headline collapse, a subtle and fascinating story of wealth preservation. How did some people, already possessing significant fortune, manage not just to survive the initial storm, but to come out on top? To understand this, we must first look at the world that built the precarious financial structure of the 1870s. Imagine a nation recovering from the wounds of conflict, yet suddenly energized by industrial might and a belief in endless possibility. This was the Gilded Age, characterized by a rapid, almost breathless expansion of industry. Steam-powered engines, and the coal that fed them, were replacing older ways of work. Factories were multiplying, churning out iron, steel, and machinery at a rate never before seen. This profound shift was not just about machines. It was driven by ambition and capital. At the center of it all was global trade, facilitated by a banking system that was evolving but still relatively fragmented and unregulated. The dominant force, the true engine of growth, and the ultimate object of immense speculation was the railroad. To connect a continent and lay thousands of miles of track through wilderness was an engineering marvel that required enormous amounts of money. The railroads were the original tech boom. In this era, if you were a major financier or a wealthy investor, the railroads were where you sought to place your capital. The federal government, eager to see the West settled and resources tapped, encouraged this expansion. It granted massive tracts of land to railroad companies and provided substantial financial support through loans. Consider this powerful alliance: the resources of a growing nation, the ingenuity of engineers, and the money of eager investors, all pulling in the same direction. It was a period when men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, and J.P. Morgan, even then a rising power, began to amass fortunes that were, until then, almost unimaginable. Vast numbers of new companies were formed, each promising to build lines that would open up new territories and generate immense profits. The potential seemed limitless. These companies needed cash, and they raised it by issuing stocks and bonds. Banks, seeing the potential for high returns and safe collateral in railroad land, lent money aggressively. The financial press amplified the excitement, writing glowing reports about the coming era of prosperity. This entire structure, this rapid growth and widespread investment, rested on confidence that new tracks would yield immediate returns and that the economic expansion would continue indefinitely. However, beneath this veneer of unprecedented prosperity, significant pressure was building. We can see it now, looking back through the lens of history, but at the time, many chose to ignore the warning signs. The expansion of credit was one critical pressure point. In simple terms, too much money was being lent, often with insufficient real value backing it up. Banks, competing for business, lowered their standards. People, from small shopkeepers to large industrialists, were borrowing heavily, assuming the good times would last. The banking system itself, particularly in the United States, was far from stable. National banking acts had created a more uniform currency, but they had not created a central lender to stabilize the system in times of crisis. Small-town banks deposited their excess funds in larger city banks, which in turn deposited funds in still larger banks in New York City. This layered system was like a house of cards, where a disturbance at any level could ripple through the entire structure. Furthermore, the infrastructure boom, while impressive in its scale, was often chaotic and poorly planned. Many railroads were being built in direct competition with one another, duplicating lines through the same territory. Some tracks were laid across vast expanses of land where few people lived and little industry existed. Relying on future and often highly optimistic projections for traffic, in many cases, railroad companies were taking on enormous debts to build infrastructure that could not possibly generate enough revenue in the short term to pay for itself. Imagine a situation where multiple groups are all building expensive highways to the same sparsely populated destination. each financing their project by selling promised profits that can only materialize. If millions of people decide to use the road at once, this, in essence, was happening with many railroad ventures. The pressure was also being felt internationally. European investors, who had historically funded much of America's expansion, particularly British capitalists with significant resources, were beginning to show signs of caution. Their caution was not just about American investments. Europe itself was experiencing its own financial instability, especially after a crisis in Vienna earlier in 1873. Any tightening of credit from Europe, any withdrawal of capital, would instantly remove a crucial support for American railroad construction. This atmosphere of excessive lending, optimistic speculation, and international interdependence created a system that was incredibly fragile. The entire complex operation required a continuous influx of new money and unrelenting confidence, but that confidence was about to be shaken to its core. The first major turning point, the decisive crack that would shatter the fragile confidence of the era, occurred in September 1873. The event centered on one of the most respected, powerful, and successful banking houses in all of the United States, J. Cooke & Company. J. Cooke, often referred to as the financier of the Civil War, earned an impeccable reputation for selling government bonds to ordinary citizens during the conflict. His successful fundraising had been crucial to the Union victory. His banking house was synonymous with financial strength, trustworthiness, and wise investment. After the war, he turned his focus, like so many others, to railroads. His latest and most ambitious project was the financing of the Northern Pacific Railway. The Northern Pacific was to be a massive transcontinental line, stretching from the Great Lakes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, opening up a vast northern tier of the American continent. J. Cooke & Company took on the primary responsibility for selling the bonds to fund this audacious project. They used the same successful methods they had with government bonds, marketing heavily to small, everyday investors, convincing thousands to put their life savings into this new frontier. But this time, the venture was different. The Northern Pacific was not a government-backed war effort. It was a speculative infrastructure project through sparsely settled land. Costs soared, construction proved to be far more difficult and expensive than expected, and the railroad was not generating enough immediate income. Cooke and his partners found themselves carrying an increasingly heavy and unsustainable burden. They were lending more money from their own bank to the railroad to keep construction going, hoping that the tide would soon turn and they could sell the bonds. It was a race against time, and time was running out. They were heavily exposed, their entire reputation and wealth tied to the success of this one massive and failing venture. In late August and early September 1873, rumors began to swirl in Philadelphia, New York, and London. People whispered about the financial health of J. Cooke & Company. They wondered if the mighty financier had overreached himself. In an attempt to secure a major loan from European investors, J. Cooke traveled to London but was unsuccessful. His failure to find new money was a critical moment, confirmed the darkest rumors. On September 18, 1873, the impossible happened. The Philadelphia headquarters of J. Cooke & Company was forced to close its doors, declaring bankruptcy. A notice was posted simply stating they could not meet their obligations. The news hit the financial world like a thunderclap. Imagine the shock and disbelief that must have spread through the streets. If the great J. Cooke, the pillar of American finance, could fail, who was safe? The reaction in the stock market was immediate. Panic, pure and unadulterated, took hold. Investors began to sell their shares in not only Cooke's interests, but every other major company as well. Within days, other banks and firms that had lent money to Cooke or were heavily invested in railroads began to fail. Trust vanished. Depositors, afraid for their own savings, began to queue at bank counters to withdraw their money before it was all gone. A run on the banks had begun, and with it, the entire speculative bubble built on railroad promises began to rapidly deflate. The situation on the streets, near the stock exchange, and at the bank counters was getting tense. This was not a slow slowdown. It was an acute crisis. At this moment, as confidence crumbled, the question was no longer about profit, it was about survival. Where would this spiral end, and for whom? The suspension of J. Cooke & Company was not simply a corporate failure. It was the trigger for a systemic breakdown. The news acted like an infectious fear that spread from Philadelphia to the steps of the New York Stock Exchange. Imagine a time where news traveled only as fast as a telegraph or steam train, yet the panic spread with an almost organic speed. Depositors across the city, and soon across the entire nation, were arriving at their local banks not to make a deposit but to take their money out. They were fearful that their lifelong savings would vanish overnight. Within days, dozens of other financial institutions were forced to suspend payments or declare bankruptcy. Banks, suddenly stripped of the reserves they held on behalf of other depositors, could not meet the demands for cash. In response, a powerful tightening of credit occurred almost immediately. Consider this: as banks failed, they could no longer lend money. If they couldn't lend, businesses, from small family-owned shops to large industrial factories, could no longer operate. A shoe manufacturer in Boston, for instance, relied on short-term bank loans to buy leather and pay its workers until it sold its goods. Without credit, the factory ground to a halt. This was not an isolated event. It was happening everywhere. This single mechanism, the complete disappearance of easy credit, is what transformed a financial panic into a full-blown economic depression. Visual cue. Early industrial photographs showing idled machinery and quiet factory floors. The situation escalated dramatically on September 20th, 1873, just 2 days after Cooke's failure. The New York Stock Exchange was so overrun by panicked sellers and collapsing stock values that it was forced to close. Imagine the gravity of this decision. The exchange remained closed for 10 full days, the longest closure in its history to that point. This was a direct visual confession of complete market failure. In a time when the government was small and did not see its role as managing the economy, there was no central mechanism, like a modern Federal Reserve, to restore stability. The markets were left to collapse, and they did. Railroad construction, the ultimate source of the crisis, was halted across the continent as investors refused to buy any more bonds. Tens of thousands of laborers working on new tracks were suddenly out of work. As factories idled and construction ceased, unemployment rose to unprecedented levels, in some estimates as high as 15%. This meant millions of men and women, many of them recently arrived immigrants who had come with dreams of prosperity, were without work and without a safety net. Savings for those who hadn't managed to get their money out in time were lost as banks closed their doors. Struggling small businesses, unable to secure credit, closed by the thousands. Consider the human impact. For many families, this period, which came to be known as the Long Depression, was a time of severe hardship, hunger, and homelessness. It was a crisis that deeply etched itself into the national consciousness, a collective experience of profound uncertainty. Visual cue, illustrations of men waiting in breadlines in early soup kitchens. Yet even as ordinary families were suffering, a separate story was unfolding for the nation's truly wealthy, the figures who dominated the Gilded Age. For this exclusive group, the crisis was not an end, but a massive challenge, and for some, an unparalleled opportunity. How did they navigate a crisis that they, in part, had helped to create through their own ambitious speculation? The first and most important way was through preparedness. Imagine a powerful ship captain watching the clouds gather. He may not know exactly when the storm will hit, but he knows to secure the deck. The wealthiest individuals, almost without exception, did not have their entire fortune tied up in a single high-risk venture. Their portfolios were, even then, incredibly diversified. Consider the fortune of J.P. Morgan, for example. While heavily involved in financing railroads, his interests also extended to government bonds, stable banking, and real estate. For others, it might mean possessing substantial real estate in major established cities like New York and Boston. Unlike the small-town bank depositors whose life savings were in one bank, the truly wealthy were spread across multiple asset classes and industries. If railroads crashed, they still had other sources of revenue. This diversification acts as the first powerful line of defense against any specific sector's collapse. A second critical tool in their arsenal was liquidity. In simple terms, having ready cash on hand. In the years leading up to 1873, while many smaller investors were borrowing heavily to buy stock, the more sophisticated and wealthy individuals often held significant portions of their fortune in the form of gold, silver, or very stable government bonds. Consider this difference. When the panic hit and credit disappeared, a person with highly liquid assets was like someone who already had food and water while others were starving. They did not need to borrow. The disappearance of credit did not paralyze their operations or force them to sell their property in a fire sale. In fact, the ability to act with ready cash led to the second major turning point, a significant shift in the entire economic landscape. As prices of valuable assets plummeted due to the desperate need for cash among smaller investors, those with substantial liquidity were in a position of enormous power. The crisis did not destroy their wealth. It created a monumental buying opportunity. At this critical moment, as ordinary people sold what they had to simply survive, and smaller companies failed, men like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan were waiting. Carnegie, whose iron and steel mills were efficient and less dependent on debt, could use his cash to buy up competitors or key natural resources for pennies on the dollar. J.P. Morgan, through his banking house, could selectively acquire assets and securities from struggling banks or railroads, further centralizing control. This was a profound and permanent shift. The crisis was, in effect, a great consolidation. It led directly to the formation of massive, monolithic trusts and monopolies that would come to define the economy for the next several decades. While smaller firms disappeared, the few giants grew exponentially. Control of railroads, for instance, became centralized in the hands of a small number of men like Vanderbilt and Gould, could acquire lines at bankruptcy auctions. These men did not simply escape the crisis. They used it to acquire more wealth and power than they could have in stable times. This entire process was not just a natural occurrence. It was shaped by powerful, unseen advantages that the wealthy possessed, often stemming from their political and financial influence. During the crisis, there was an intense public and political debate about how the government should respond. One proposed solution was to simply print more money, the so-called soft money, or greenback, positioned to increase liquidity and ease the credit crunch for ordinary citizens. But the wealthiest financiers, whose fortunes were based on the existing gold standard, strongly opposed this. Their political influence was considerable, and their position, the hard money view, largely prevailed. This choice by policymakers prioritized the value of accumulated capital over the creation of immediate relief for the general populace. The rules of the system were interpreted, and often written, by and for those who were already winning the game. Another layer of advantage was simply information. In an era before complex regulatory bodies, powerful bankers and industrial titans often had access to non-public or inside information. Imagine knowing days or weeks in advance that a major bank was about to fail or that a key railway project was in trouble. The wealthy, with their networks of contacts across the globe, were the first to understand the extent of the brewing trouble. Some of them began to move their personal fortunes out of speculative investments and into more stable assets well before the general public was aware of the risk. They were, in effect, exiting the theater before someone yelled fire. As 1873 gave way to 1874 and 1875, the initial, dramatic phase of the panic stabilized. The markets reopened, banks that survived became more cautious, and the immediate sense of impending collapse faded. Yet this stabilization did not mark a return to prosperity. The economic landscape was forever changed. We are now entering a long, slow period of transition toward resolution, where the full consequences of this consolidation will be revealed. The financial world is no longer in freefall, but the future remains deeply uncertain, and the ordinary person is still waiting for the recovery that has passed them by. As we have seen, the Panic of 1873 was a profoundly unfair event. The crisis that devastated ordinary workers and small businesses was navigated with relative success, and even profit, by the wealthiest individuals. Their diversification, substantial ready cash, political influence, and information advantages not only protected their fortunes, but also allowed them to acquire valuable assets during a historic fire sale. By the late 1870s, the dust from the initial market collapse had settled, but the process of financial restructuring was far from complete. Imagine a large, complex, broken machine that is slowly being rebuilt into a new, smaller, and more powerful version. This was the American economy in the wake of the Panic of 1873. The era of a multitude of small competing firms and chaotic railroad expansion was effectively over. In its place, massive industrial corporations and powerful banking houses began to dominate. For the railroads, the losers were the thousands of small and medium-sized railway companies that had overextended themselves. Their properties were acquired, often through foreclosure auctions, by a handful of large, established operators. Names like Vanderbilt, Gould, and a young E.H. Harriman came to control vast, integrated systems that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was the period when the great rail monopolies were solidified. A similar process unfolded in the emerging steel industry, where Andrew Carnegie was able to acquire competitors and control every step of production. By the 1880s, his Carnegie Steel Company was a massive industrial empire. For the banks, the losers were the thousands of smaller local banks that lacked the reserves to withstand a run on their deposits. Their demise led to a similar process of consolidation. Larger, more stable banks, particularly in major financial centers like New York City, grew exponentially by absorbing the deposits and assets of failed institutions. This centralization created a banking system that was larger and in some ways more stable, but it also concentrated control in a few powerful hands. For the wealthy, the restructuring was an exercise in power and consolidation. They emerged from the long, painful period that came to be known as the Long Depression, not just having escaped, but with a firm grip on the levers of the modern industrial economy. For the ordinary person, however, the short-term reality was very different. Even as the economy stabilized, the benefits were not shared equally. Wages remained depressed for years, as the new monolithic corporations used their power to control labor costs. Unemployment persisted, and for those who did work, conditions often worsened as competition among employers was reduced. Imagine the life of a steelworker, whose job was now part of a massive, impersonal machine. With little hope of rising wages or improved conditions, for him, the recovery was only visible in the rising stock prices of the company that employed him. It was a time of profound economic inequality. It's a sharp divide between the fortunes of the wealthy and the general public during and after the crisis had a long-term impact that would reshape future finance. The Panic of 1873 exposed fundamental weaknesses in the economic system. It demonstrated that a fragmented and unregulated banking system could not manage an interconnected industrial economy. The public's realization that their savings were vulnerable and that the wealthy had been protected ignited a deep-seated demand for change. While it would take decades, this period of unrest and populist sentiment planted the seeds that would eventually lead to the significant financial regulations of the early 20th century. For example, the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was a direct response to the lack of a central stabilizing mechanism that had been so devastating in 1873. The entire movement for greater corporate accountability and antitrust legislation found its origins in this period of massive corporate consolidation. The legacy of the panic was not just internal, it had powerful long-term consequences for the global economy. In its immediate aftermath, global trade slowed, as the contraction of credit affected all corners of the interconnected world. More significantly, it marked the beginning of a shift in global economic power. While the panic was a painful event for the United States, the process of consolidation and industrialization that it accelerated allowed the U.S. to rapidly close the gap with the established European powers. Within a generation, the United States became the world's leading industrial and financial power. Consider this profound shift. A nation that had been a net borrower from Europe became a net lender. This was a process whose origins can be traced to the internal restructuring that occurred after 1873. It was a crisis that, however painfully, created the structure of the next economic superpower. Finally, let us reflect on what this period can teach us today. The story of how the rich escaped the panic of 1873 is a compelling reminder that financial crises are not simple events that affect everyone in the same way. It is a lesson about the fundamental advantages that wealth and power can provide in times of extreme uncertainty. We must consider this. The tools used by the wealthy in 1873, diversification, liquidity, political influence, and access to superior information, are the same strategies that sophisticated investors use in every crisis, including those we face today. This history raises profound questions about money, power, and the responsibilities of those who hold them. Is it enough to simply escape a crisis oneself, or do those with immense fortune and influence have a collective responsibility to help stabilize the system for the good of all? The story of 1873 shows us that in the absence of a collective sense of responsibility or effective public oversight, the market will inherently favor those with the most significant advantages. The great consolidation that followed was not just an economic change, it was a societal one. As we navigate our own complex, interconnected global economy, with its potential for both rapid growth and devastating collapse, the lessons from 1873 remain as relevant as ever. History may not repeat itself, but it does, with painful clarity, reveal the patterns of how wealth can be both a powerful shield and a relentless sword. Subscribe for more deep financial history documentaries.